Movies that are based on true events or that purport to represent historical events as they happened often get a bad rap for exaggeration. It turns out to be the case that the writers or directors took creative liberties that stretched the truth beyond its limit, which usually leads to a repudiation by historians as well as fans. It's a delicate balance to be sure. A movie based on real events or set during a specific period needs to balance entertainment and faithfulness. Stray too much to one side and you end up either making stuff up or being boring. There are some movies, however, that masterfully threaded the needle. In this video, I want to take a look at the movies that either got the historical period or the events that occurred mostly right. Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World is a 2003 epic period film directed by Peter Weir and adapted from Patrick O'Brien's series, which spans 20 novels that followed Russell Crowe's character, Jack Aubrey, a sailor in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. While the film was a financial disappointment, it was loved by critics and fans alike and earned 10 well-deserved Academy Award nominations. It's also a masterclass in period accuracy, though not necessarily source accuracy. That is, despite ostensibly being adapted from O'Brien's first novel, Master and Commander, it doesn't faithfully follow the plot of the book while, at the same time, is a historically accurate representation of sea life and naval warfare at that time. For example, the ship replica used in the movie tracks very closely with the original HMS Surprise, an 18th century French ship, the Unité, that was captured by the HMS Inconstant in 1796 and repurposed for the Royal Navy. Then there was the fact that there were children on the ship. That was also a true-to-life depiction as well. Children as young as 10 or 12 could enlist in the Royal Navy and began working as cabin boys, seamen, or servants. In a few years, they could be promoted to midshipmen. They attended to older officers and learned the ropes. It was a difficult, grueling job and, as shown in the movie, could result in catastrophic injuries. The movie also captured the chaos, calamity, and crowdedness of a ship either peacefully sailing or caught in a battle. These were places where more than 100 men, sometimes several hundred, depending on the ship, all had to work together in tight quarters in order to keep things moving along. The film did an admirable job at portraying naval battles as well. Because cannon fire traveled slower than light, you would see the flash of the cannon, which gave you some time to duck before being broadsided with cannon fire. When the balls hit, there will be plenty of splintering of wood, which could be as deadly as the cannonballs themselves. The cannons themselves were held by thick ropes to limit how far they could recoil after being fired. Battles were hot, messy, cacophonous, and after exchanging enough fire, a pall of smoke was set over the immediate area. There would be so much smoke, you might not even be able to see the enemy's ship. If you took out the enemy's mast and rigging, you would essentially deprive them of their engine, allowing them to be boarded or allowing you to get away. Then, when it came to boarding, things would get even more hectic. Hundreds of men would clash, exchanging volleys of gunfire. Because the battlefield was so small, you would be sure to see the whites of their eyes. If there was any romance in the idea of battle from afar, that notion was certainly dashed once the sailors were in the thick of it. The filmmakers even paid attention to minute details, such as keeping time with an hourglass, leaving a man overboard during a storm, and performing an amputation without anesthetic. The fidelity to reality, as well as masterful directing by Peter Weir, has made Master and Commander one of the best films of the 21st century so far. Apollo 13 is one of my favorite movies of all time. Starring Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, and Bill Paxton, it's a dramatization of the events that occurred during the real Apollo 13 mission, mainly the fact that the mission had to be aborted after an oxygen tank exploded a couple of days into the mission. The three-man crew, instead of landing on the moon as originally intended, ended up using the moon's gravity to essentially slingshot around the moon and return to Earth. While Apollo 11's moon landing is perhaps the finest moment in human history of the 20th century, Apollo 13 is as much of a show of human ingenuity as anything else. There was a real concern that the three men would not make it back, but, working hand in hand with NASA on Earth, some of the brightest minds alive at the time mustered the greatest rescue mission ever conceived. All of the emotion, drama, and terror that I'm sure the crew, their peers, and the families felt were captured in Ron Howard's masterpiece. Lost Moon: The Perilous Voyage of Apollo 13, written by Apollo 13 astronaut Jim Lovell, served as the basis for the movie, and Lovell also provided commentary on the film. One of the biggest points of accuracy was the dialogue between ground control and the astronauts, which was taken nearly verbatim from transcripts and recordings. One bit of dialogue that has entered popular vernacular, "Houston, we have a problem," was a bit of a misquote though. It was first said by Jack Swigert, who said, "Houston, we've had a problem here." Ground control then replied, "This is Houston, say again please." To which Jim Lovell answered, "Houston, we've had a problem." In the grand scheme of things, though, this is pretty minor. And minor is the watchword for the kind of changes that they made. It's not like they added an extra astronaut or something like that. For example, when the oxygen tank explodes in the movie, the crew hears it right away. In reality, it took them 95 seconds to hear the bang. Whereas the film has an argument between Jack Swigert and Fred Haise, there was no argument in real life because there was no way to know that stirring the oxygen tanks as Swigert did would cause an explosion. That argument was added for dramatic effect, as were many of the small changes. Overall, Apollo 13 is a masterclass in how real-life events should be portrayed on the screen. Sure, accentuate some parts for dramatic effect, but when you have an event like Apollo 13, you don't need to do much. The drama is pretty much built in. The word masterpiece gets thrown around a lot, but it's difficult to call Kon Ichikawa's 1959 film, Fires on the Plain, anything but a masterpiece. It's one of the bleakest, most searing realist war films ever made. In fact, this might be the one war film where the criticism is the fact that it's too honest a portrayal of the degradations of war. This is not a feel-good film. There's no message of one man helping thousands, like in Schindler's List, or a group of soldiers putting their lives on the line to help a soldier return home, like in Saving Private Ryan. Perhaps the only other comparable film to Fires on the Plain is 1985's Come and See, directed by Ilham Kilmov, another searing anti-war portrayal that focuses on the German occupation of Belarus and has, perhaps, the finest example of child acting ever. Now, Fires on the Plain, like Come and See, is a visceral, in-your-face kind of movie. The film takes place in Leyte during the final year of World War II, when the Allies have cut off the Japanese from support and supplies. The very first scene of the movie has a commanding officer smacking a soldier, Tamura, who has tuberculosis and forcing him to go back to a hospital because his unit cannot take care of him. Within the first 3 minutes, the officer tells him that if he can't get help, then he should just die. This is a movie without honor and humanity. For Ichikawa, there is no glory in war. And more to the point, it's true to life and the lived experience of some Japanese soldiers during World War II. Japanese soldiers were treated very harshly by their own military. There was an emphasis on loyalty and obedience to the point of self-sacrifice. Surrender was seen as shameful. If you were gonna die, you should try to bring a few enemy soldiers with you. POWs were subject to malnutrition and starvation, and in Fires on the Plain, so were the soldiers. In fact, the lack of food gets to be so bad that the soldiers' teeth start falling out. This is what Bosley Crowther, writing for the New York Times, wrote, quote, "Never have I seen a more grisly and physically repulsive film than Fires on the Plain. So purposely putrid is it, so full of degradation and death, as it recounts the harrowing experiences of a Japanese army straggler in Leyte toward the end of World War II, that I doubt if anyone can sit through it without becoming a little bit ill and losing appetite for the next meal. That's how horrible it is," end quote. He goes on to praise Ichikawa, noting that the auteur accomplishes what he means to do, mainly show what war really is like. He says that Ichikawa, quote, "has made the sensation so graphic, so shockingly vivid and real through the slow accumulation of details that are almost too hideous to describe," end quote, so that when you get near the end and see a soldier's mouth covered in the blood of another human, you're too numb to the cannibalism that just took place. And James Rich said of the film, quote, "Once you've seen Fires on the Plain, the movie will get under your skin and you'll find it impossible to forget," end quote. He's right. Most war films will have some message of hope underneath all the blood and carnage. That, perhaps after the fires die out, a brighter future might emerge from the ashes, that there might be some humanity. Fires on the Plain is not such a film. There's no light at the end of this tunnel. Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. 1970's Tora, Tora, Tora is an interesting film. It's about the attack on Pearl Harbor and tells the stories from the Japanese and American perspectives. The American sequences were directed by Richard Fleischer, who did movies like 1954's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and 1966's Fantastic Voyage. The Japanese sequence was supposed to be directed by legendary director Akira Kurosawa, but he was replaced 2 weeks later by Toshio Masuda and Kinji Fukasaku, the latter of whom directed the Battles Without Honor and Humanity series, some of the finest Yakuza movies ever made. The goal was to, as accurately as possible, depict the events of Pearl Harbor for both the American and Japanese sides. The screenplay was adapted from books written by military historians Ladislas Farago and Gordon Prange, while some of the technical advisors that consulted for the film were military men involved in planning the attack, including Minoru Genda, one of the lead architects of the attack, and later Chief of Staff of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. The movie was accurate from the jump, showing how tensions between the United States and Japan had been rising for years over Japan's territorial expansion and their alliance with Germany and Italy in 1940. Lawrence Swid, writing for the U.S. Naval Institute, wrote, quote, Tora was reasonably accurate in its portrayal of the 7 December 1941 Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, end quote. He did say that there were some minor errors, such as, quote, during the launch sequence, the slat deck of the USS Yorktown is clearly masquerading as the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, end quote. Though, as far as historical accuracy goes, not being able to secure the exact type of aircraft carrier you need isn't that big of a deal. But it's not like that they didn't try. Producer Elmo Williams wanted dozens of planes to fly off of an aircraft carrier and drop real torpedoes. He even wanted to travel around abandoned Japanese airfields in the Pacific to try and find planes that had been decommissioned or left behind. He would have done it too if he wasn't talked out of it as being a very long, expensive idea. Reviews ended up being mixed, thanks in part to the filmmakers prizing accuracy over the drama. Rotten Tomatoes' critical consensus captures it well. Quote, Tora is scrupulously accurate and lays out the tragedy of Pearl Harbor with intricate detail, but the film's clinical approach to the sound and fury signifies little feeling, end quote. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to call Tora a dramatized documentary. The general beats of the movie are known, and we know how it's going to play out. Rather, it's more to give color and life to an event that we learn about in grade school. One thing that it did that went mostly unspoken, though, is the fact that it didn't play into the stereotypes of Japanese people that were more common in American war films before it. Rather, it humanized them. Wendell Jameson, writing for HistoryNet, noted that the, quote, Japanese were usually portrayed in American films as evil, duplicitous, and often incompetent, plotting their schemes behind bottle glass spectacles. Tora changed that. The Japanese were skilled, honorable military professionals here, wrestling with the horror that they were about to unleash, in charge of a skilled fighting force of awesome power, end quote. In the end, what it lacked in drama, it certainly made up for in accuracy. All the President's Men is probably the greatest political movie ever made. Directed by Alan J. Pakula, the screenplay, written by William Goldman, was adapted from the 1974 nonfiction book All the President's Men by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. The Washington Post reporters that investigated the 1972 break-in at the Watergate office building and the subsequent scandal that brought down an administration. By virtue of the involvement of the original authors, as well as the recency of the events, All the President's Men had the benefit of being made while the history was still being written. The film covers the first 7 months of the scandal, from the break-in in 1972 to Nixon's second inauguration in 1973, with a montage that shows the events that transpired after that fact. The film included Hal Holbrook as Deep Throat, a secret informant that provided Woodward with the information pertaining to the Nixon administration's involvement in the scandal. More than a decade after Nixon's death, Mark Felt, who worked in the FBI, was revealed to be Deep Throat. Even physical accuracy was very important here. Pakula went to great lengths to recreate the Washington Post office. In a 1975 article written for the Post, quote, the movie people themselves have been in and out of the Post for months in an effort to soak up authenticity, rub elbows with newspaper people, and learn the routine of a daily newspaper, end quote. So, how far did they go? For one, the crew bought 200 desks at $500 each from the same company that the Post bought theirs from, and even had them colored in the same paint. Duplicates of arts and prints that were hung in the Post were acquired where possible. They even had reporters ship them their actual trash and clippings to the set so that they could have the same level of disarray. There were no action scenes, no fights, or anything of that sort in the movie. The closest we get is Robert Redford, playing Bob Woodward, yelling at Deep Throat in a parking lot because he's putting his career on the line and chasing the story. Even the break-in and subsequent capture of the criminals is handled in a calm, clinical way. There's no fights where the burglars try to make a break for it. It's a movie that has a lot of dialogue, a lot of research, and a lot of downtime thinking and figuring out a way to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It's impressive when you consider that Woodward and Bernstein, while being involved, didn't have approval over the script, but were consulted quite heavily to ensure its accuracy. The film also does a great job at balancing the rising level of distrust that had been building against the government throughout the 60s, as well as the role of newspapers and journalists in speaking truth to power, something that will always be necessary. Steven Spielberg's 2012 film Lincoln covers the last few months of Abraham Lincoln's life, from January of 1865 up through his assassination in April of the same year. It focuses on Lincoln's efforts to end slavery, the Civil War, and his attempt to pass the 13th Amendment. One thing that the movie got right, according to historians, is Lincoln as a storyteller. Lincoln enjoyed telling jokes and stories in order to make a point or to diffuse tension. One example in the movie is when he tells a story about Ethan Allen, a soldier during the Revolutionary War and one of the founders of Vermont. Allen finds himself in a British outhouse and sees a portrait of George Washington, which he turns into a joke about how nothing would make an Englishman shit himself faster than the sight of the old general. It also captured the overall attitude of Thaddeus Stevens, played by Tommy Lee Jones, fairly well. Stevens was vehemently opposed to slavery and thought that Lincoln was far too slow in moving to abolish it. Lincoln had gone from supporting the Corwin Amendment, which would have entrenched slavery when he was running for president, to slowly moving towards Stevens' position that slavery could not endure if the country was to endure. Stevens went a step further, arguing that land should be confiscated from slaveholders and turned over to the slaves, though he was thwarted in this attempt by the moderates. In the movie, Stevens has a couple of wonderful moments of dialogue, such as when he explains to Lincoln that his constituents didn't elect him to follow them, but to lead them. Then, in Congress, he inveighs against both Fernando Wood and George Pendleton, both Copperhead Democrats that favored the Confederacy. The real-life Stevens also had some great quotes. One of my favorites, taken from his papers, is, quote, "You must be a bastard, for I knew your mother's husband, and he was a gentleman and honest man," end quote. Another was, quote, "John Brown deserves to be hung for being a hopeless fool. He attempted to capture Virginia with 17 men, when he ought to have known that it would require at least 25, end quote. The overall passing of the 13th Amendment was also true to form. Not everyone was on board with it. In order to secure its passage, it's possible that political positions were given in exchange for votes, otherwise known as patronage. At the very least, Lincoln and his associates had to wrangle a lot of votes in order to secure the necessary 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House in order to send the amendment to the states for ratification. One distinct feature of Lincoln is his voice. Horace White, a journalist at the Chicago Tribune that covered Lincoln during his legendary debates with Stephen Douglas for the United States Senate, wrote that Lincoln had, quote, "a thin tenor, or rather falsetto, voice, almost as high-pitched as a boatswain's whistle," end quote. Daniel Day-Lewis was able to mimic this about as well as anyone could hope. Interestingly, two other presidents that are known for their grandiosity also had small voices. George Washington could sometimes barely be heard, while Thomas Jefferson, though quick with the pen, was not given to oratory. Alan Guelzo, formerly a professor at Gettysburg College and a leading Lincoln scholar, wrote that, quote, "The pains that have been taken in the name of historical authenticity in this movie are worth hailing just on their own terms," end quote. This, I think, is the best that we can expect from history movies that try to condense months or years into hours. 1981's Das Boot, directed by Wolfgang Petersen and adapted from Lothar Gunther Buchheim's 1973 novel of the same name, is considered to be the most realistic submarine movie ever made. In fact, in 2019, the U.S. Naval Institute surveyed multiple Navy officers, including a Vice Chief of Naval Operations, the Commander of United States Naval Forces Europe-Africa, the 30th Chief of Naval Operations, and more, and asked them what they thought the most realistic submarine movie was. 11 out of 17 of them named Das Boot. Admiral Robert Burke noted that, quote, "You can feel the crew's hopes and dreams as well as their fear and claustrophobia. You can almost smell the hydraulic fluid, diesel fuel, and sweat," end quote. Admiral James G. Fogo III added that, quote, "Monotonous boredom compounded with unpredictable and acute periods of extreme danger portrays the roller coaster life of submarine sailors on both sides of the conflict," end quote. Sailors were essentially trapped in a metal death trap with insane amounts of pressure wanting to crush them on all sides. On a good day, life was tedious, monotonous, and cold. On a bad day, life literally flashed before their very eyes. In recreating the set, Petersen was able to rely on thousands of photos that Buchheim took when he was stationed aboard German submarine U-96, where he spent time as a war correspondent. Buchheim did take some issues with the final movie though. He thought that it leaned a bit too much into the action. For example, there's a scene where many bolts are ejected from the walls. Buchheim contested that even a single bolt loosening would be enough to cause panic, while so many would spell disaster. He also did not like that it was more of a Hollywood flick than what he intended it to be, which was an anti-war film. Still, it makes up for that in capturing the overall feeling of spending time on a submarine, something that, according to American soldiers, seems to transcend cultures. While submarines have surely improved over the years, it seems as though the experience of staying aboard one has changed little, if at all. Getting a movie to be completely accurate to real-life events is an impossible task. You're trying to condense thousands of characters across days, months, or years, often in harrowing situations, into a 2 or 3 hour film. That means that you're going to have to cut a lot of good material. It's why most movies opt to go for an emotional punch at the cost of historical accuracy, in an attempt to draw the audience into what the director thought that the experience could have been like. But these movies show that you don't need to sacrifice authenticity in order to make a great movie. Sometimes confronting the problems head-on, like in Fires on the Plain, is necessary. Other times, getting the small details right, like in Master and Commander, is what's needed. Still, at other times, getting the dialogue, as in the communications between the astronauts and ground control in Apollo 13, is what you need to do. Whatever the case, more historical movies could use a team that is willing to go through the facts with a fine-toothed comb and apply them to the big screen in a seamless way. It is, evidently, totally doable.